Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I want to thank you all for tuning in today. We get these kind of questions a lot. How do you apply for council grants? What do you all look for? Who is the council anyway? So today we're going to be talking about some of the answers to your questions and hopefully make it a little more clear and a little less stressful when it comes to applying for our grants. The first thing I wanted to say was that the council, we're 100% federally funded. And we have a 23-member body that's appointed by the governor's office, and that council acts to decide how we allocate our funding. So currently we're under a 5-year state plan. The 3 goals that we are prioritizing are self-advocacy. Self-advocacy meaning giving individuals with developmentals opportunities to make decisions over their own lives, to be able to teach them how to speak up for themselves, to be able to learn how to become leaders in their community. And so some of the things that we're supporting right now is supported decision making in Arizona to give people an opportunity to to make decisions beyond guardianship. And then we also are looking at how to expand voting options. So those are just examples for under that goal, things we funded. Another goal we have, oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to do the slides. You can tell we're not really into technology over here at the council. We're more about boots on the ground. Another thing that we're looking at is employment. So we look at how to expand opportunities for people to be trained, to be working in inclusive settings. And so one of the current grants that we funded was under the city of Tempe. They're starting a model hiring program where they're actually embedding hiring people with significant disabilities within the city, working with community partners to do so. So that's an example of one of the grants that we funded. The last goal that we are allocating funding for is community inclusion. This is a very broad goal. We are looking at ways to remove barriers and promote inclusion in all areas of community life so that people can participate in activities, they can do recreational things, they can that when we look at how we deliver programs and services, that people with disabilities are included broadly. So those are a few of the goals that we are doing for this next until 2021. People always ask us, when are you releasing grants? So the beauty of this, of you all coming to this webinar today, is that you're already on our grants list. So that means that whenever we have a solicitation that goes out, you all will be notified when we have that. If you know other people who want to be on this list that aren't on today's webinar, just have them email us at the council and we'll add them to our list to make sure that they're alerted whenever there's a grant. We have several coming out this spring, so just be aware, and the summer, so just be aware of checking into whenever we send out notifications. Oh, can you guys see the slides okay? Yeah. Because I haven't gotten to this yet. Okay, so everybody's really anxious about the slides. So I haven't gotten to this part of the presentation yet. I just wanted to go over the council goals and things, but I wanted to be able to talk about, who the presenters are in today's webinar. So it's going to be Marcy Crane. She's going to be talking about how to write a winning proposal so you'll get funded. So those are important tips, understanding the terminology that looks like legalese, and just giving you basic overall tips on what to do and what not to do. George will be providing some great examples too, because he's actually not gotten grants to the council and has gotten grants from the council. So he can tell you what not to do and what to do as well. And so by the end of this conversation today, you all are welcome to ask us any questions that you want, if we haven't covered them in our presentation today. And again, thank you all for attending. And yeah, this is what they're talking about. This is the things that we're doing. So we talked about that. And let me just let you know too that we usually award about $1 million each year in different projects. Now, people ask us how big our grants are. It can vary in size. It can be very small to large depending on the project. So just look at the solicitation and it'll say how much the award is. And then I also wanted to mention as well, one of the top things that we look for as a council, we are always looking for ways to test new ideas. or to try things that have not been done before and make them sustainable so that others can follow the examples of you all who get the grants. So that's why we use the grantees, is that because you guys are our boots on the ground to try new things and new ideas. So when we look at proposals, we want to make sure that you guys aren't doing the same thing that you've always been doing and just looking for replacement funding, because we actually are not allowed to do that under federal guidelines. So we're looking for ways for you, if you're looking for ways to expand or look for a new population or test a new idea, but you've never had the funding to do so, those are things that we could potentially fund. So just be clear that they're connected to our goals that are on our site, and check back at our site, because the goals won't change. They'll stay the same until 2021. But also look on our site, because there'll be information on the current grants that are out there as well and what we're looking for. Okay, with that said, the next speaker is Marcy Crane. She is our Trustee Grants Manager, and she can talk to you about what to do when it comes to like how to prepare for applying for our grants. So go ahead, Marcy. Take it away.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Erica, very much, and to George Garcia and to NAU for helping to set this up. I want to let you guys know I have 2 staff people here with me to assist me, because I am like so anti-webinar techie person. Give me a rule book to read. I'll be more than happy to get back with you on the summary, but when it comes to technology, it's not my forte. So if you see me motioning to my left or to my right, it's because I have some assistance here to get me through this. I want to thank each and every one of you. It looks like we've got 42 folks on the webinar, which is great. And I really appreciate everyone taking their time this afternoon. And it looks like we're going to be handling questions at the end. So if there's something I'm going through that is triggering a question, please jot it down and make sure you type it in so that we can answer all the questions. Or even after the webinar, my contact information is available. So I hope to hear from many of you. So the next slide I'm going to cover, the first slide, is I want to talk about some basic terminology, because I think you hear a lot of different terms depending on which state agency you're talking to, or whether you apply directly through the federal government. And so you'll see these terms like RFGA. We use a lot of acronyms. We're so famous for acronyms. And so we have to remember that we have to spell them out or be cognizant of what we're talking about to the general public. RFP, a NOFA, or an RFA, those are all acronyms for basically what the federal agency is releasing: a solicitation of funds, request for grant application, request for proposal, a notice of funding application, a request for application. They all mean the same thing in one way or another. It's a solicitation that we are releasing some funds. We want some applications to come in. So that's just a general terminology I just want to make you aware of. Second is, what do we mean by the term a contract? Basically, if you apply for a grant, you apply through an RFP process or ours. We use RFGA, request for a grant application. You go through that process, which is quite lengthy. You manage to make it through the evaluation and clarify your response. And some big board makes a decision to say, yes, we like your proposal and we want to award some grant money to you. You then become officially known as a contract. So, for example, the Arizona Developmental Council, coming back on. I'll make a note here. Okay, so, and that's another problem I'm having here, is that for some reason I am buffering in and out. So I apologize right up front. We're going to have to let that kind of go through, and then I will come back to what my thought and slide is. So when we say contract, that means we have an official contract that's been accepted, and you are now in charge of doing what you said you were going to do. It's legally binding, and we are going to monitor you, and we're going to provide the funding to you based on your program output and your outcomes. So just know there's a difference. We also use the word grant. We have a number of grants with, we have a number of contracts with, but it really means we've agreed to fund you, and it becomes a legally binding contract. And what that also means is at any time, we can undo that contract if we need to, because there's some sort of performance problem or there's something more going on with your organization that perhaps we become concerned about. So that just is a legal term. We have a contract in place. Recipient, that's another term we use, but I don't use it too much in terms of with the community partners that we fund. It's more as we have to deal with the federal government or with the Department of Economic Security. They see us as recipients of federal funds that we pass through to a contract, to a formal agency that's going to receive a contract. Pass-through entity, again, we receive federal monies. We apply, so our grant monies are all federal. We have to apply for these dollars on an annual basis. We receive the federal award notice from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and then we in turn make that available as pass-through. So that just means that we've been awarded the funds. Now we're allowed to disperse those funds in a way that is legal. So we have a number of different mechanisms in place in how we do that. So a pass-through entity just means that we're receiving federal money and we're going to disperse it. Subrecipients, I kind of see this in two ways. We, the feds see us, see the pass-through entities that we fund as subrecipients, or I also see as a contractor that we've awarded, they may have some funds going out to a contractor that they've hired on. Those are known as subrecipients to us as well. But it's somehow money's going down to a third organization who's going to be doing some work on behalf of whoever received the funds. So again, there's just another terminology to be aware of. Scope of work. Okay, so this is where we kind of get into some nitty-gritty here. When we have to release dollars out to the public for any one of our goals, for example, our state plan is pretty detailed and we're always working on it, and we have to resubmit changes on an annual basis for our objectives or our measurements or something we do or something we plan to do in the future. What that means is that when we want to release a competitive solicitation, we have to develop a scope of work. So for example, the scope of works are going to detail what the main objective that we're trying to Okay, so I'm back on site here. So what that means is that when we issue our scope of work, we're going to write what the main objective is, how much funding is available, how many applicants we plan to award, whether it's single or multiple. We usually lay out some specific terminology that may be related to the scope of work that we want to make sure everyone's on the same page of understanding. And then we're going to lay out specific tasks that we want the applicant to reply. So they provide a project narrative around how they plan to achieve that objective we're trying to fund. And the narrative could be anywhere from a minimum of 5 pages to 20 pages, depending on the technicality of the scope of work. Usually what's also included in the scope of work is we're laying out some budget detail. We may want an implementation plan. You'll have to lay out who are your key staff people, and maybe some letters of support or a memorandum of understanding with your partners. So we're going to detail all of that information in your scope of work. So when I have a pre-application conference, I spend a lot of time on the scope of work to go over it, because it's really important for applicants to know if this is something they want to go after, if it's something that it's in their purview of their organization and their mission that they do, or if they think somebody else they could partner with and they could take the lead on it. But we should be, in our area, in the office, we should be very clear on our scope of work, because that's where the detail is. We have our state plan that kind of generalizes our objectives, but our scope of work is really helps define what we want a funder to do, the applicant to do when they're awarded. So you're helping us achieve our overall state plan goals. And we want to help you succeed, and we can only do that when we're really clear on the requirements and for you to apply. So we're going to do some computer stuff here, but I'm going to continue on. Next slide. Okay, now I'm stuck. Okay, so we're going to talk about more terms here. Oh, my favorite, OMB, Office of Management and Budget. we have a lot of federal rules and regulations to manage our federal award, as anyone who does that applies for grants. And what we want to make sure that we are in line with the rules and regulations. So not only does OMB, besides being this really big agency within the White House overseas, they really provide the guidance for not only how we manage federal grants, but also how can those dollars be used. So they provide, for example, they say entertainment costs are not allowable. So if you want to somehow provide a circus as part of an activity on a Saturday for a group of family members, and that's in your budget, I could go back and say that's not an allowable cost. Now, if you want to put in a cost for a consultant to help you do a research study, that's an allowable cost. And so we have to follow those rules. We pass that responsibility on to the applicant or to the contract so that you guys know as well. And in the next slide, I believe I provide the website for that and /circulars. So depending on who your organization is, if you're a nonprofit, if you're part of an Indian tribe, a local unit of a government, which I mean your city, state, county official, there are circulars for each of those entities, and it's really incumbent upon you to understand which circular applies to you, not only to manage a grant, but what are your cost allowability, your cost principles, because those are two things that work together that keep you out of being high risk, and that certainly is something you don't want to do. So I provide that link to you. Be more than happy to go into more detail one-on-one with anybody who has questions on that. Okay, audits. Here's one thing to just kind of know off the bat that we'll ask as part of our grant application process. If your organization in any funding fiscal year period, so your fiscal year period may be different than our fiscal year period. We have an October 1 through September 30th, which is a federal fiscal year period. But we also operate under the state fiscal period of July 1 through June, but that's not our period in terms of reporting to the feds. So depending on your fiscal period, if you receive more than $750,000 in combined federal grant dollars, you have to make sure your organization has been audited under a circular called A133. And that's within any one given year period. If it's less than that, then you don't need it, but what you should have and what we will require you to provide, is verification that you've had your organization audited at least by a certified public accountant, a CPA, every 2 years. And we can request that information as part of our grant application if we need to. But it's really good fiscal policy to have that in place. You should have that auditing purposes, because we want to know that we're awarding funds to an agency that has the capacity and has the policies in place to manage a grant. Oh, okay. This was the office suggestion, just because it's so much terminology. This is me in San Diego last year with my sister's dog, Rose. She's a beautiful pitty, and she's a rescue, and I do a lot of rescues. Okay, CFDA number. This is also really important to kind of know, because your auditor or your CPA would need to know this. So if you are applying and receive federal funds, you should see somewhere in the solicitation what the CFDA number, which means the Catalog for Federal Domestic Assistance. You could punch in the CFDA number on Google for a grant award, and it will pop up who is the federal agency that oversees it, what is the public law. You can read all about the backup and requirements on it, but basically you need to know that number when your CPA is going to audit your agency, because that tells you you're receiving federal dollars. If you receive state dollars, I don't believe there's a CFDA number, because those dollars are allocated from the state legislature. So when you apply for grants, at least what I do is I put our CFDA number so that folks know we are federally funded, what the public law number is, and we tell what federal act we're authorized under. So if you don't know that, if that's not clear in the solicitation, ask the person who released the solicitation, are these federal grant dollars? Are they state allocation dollars? You need to know that for purposes for auditing. Two things I want to cover in regards to high-risk grantees, and I think I have about 2 slides on this, and this is kind of something that will go along in the later section that I'll talk about. High-risk grantees are basically applicants that we know of or throughout a contract period have a lot of issues in regards to unresolved auditing issues. They're delinquent on programmatic and fiscal reporting. They have poor prior performance areas. And sometimes there are awards made to them, but what the funder will do, such as us, the council will do, is we may add additional terms and conditions, or what we call special terms and conditions, to that applicant, where we may have more increased monitoring. We may hold up payment of invoices until we get certain requirements met. These are all things that we're allowed to do, but a high-risk grantee is really something you don't want to find yourself in at all, or avoid or get out of it as quickly as you can. You want to become compliant with those areas, because if they're persistent, if they continue to be long-standing, or at least a criminal, you're not going to get awards from federal agencies or from our office, more likely, and also from probably foundations, because they ask for a lot more information than what we do. So these are all things that if you know your organization has been struggling with, you want to quickly, as soon as possible, take care of those issues so that you can apply for funds. I think I was going to go through a couple more stuff before we ask George. Okay, so one of the things I think it's very important for applicants to understand is your organization and what your organization stands for in the community, what you do, who you partner with. And I think it's really important before you apply for grants, you kind of do a self-assessment on your organization, and important to make sure that you align with the funder who's releasing the solicitation. So you should, these are some things, common things you may not. Think you have. So we had another buffer issue. So what we're going to do is make sure that when you apply for a grant, look at what our organization does in our mission statement and make sure that your mission and vision is somewhat aligned with what we do. We work with the community on developmental disabilities and families, caregivers, the systems that are in charge of that. And so we want to make sure that when you're reviewing your organization, do you have a mission and vision statement that's clear? Your staff, your immediate staff and key staff that work on programs, does everyone know what you guys do? Are you all on the same page? If you were with a legislature in an elevator and they happen to be from your congressional district and you introduce yourself, could you give what we call a 5-minute elevator speech, or maybe it's down to 2 minutes? You know, state who you are, why you do it, why it's important, so that you are very clear in that. And the reason why I put this in here is because many times in solicitations, we sometimes do this, but I see this very often with federal grants, is you provide an executive summary, and you should be providing that in 2 sentences or 3 sentences as a short paragraph. And if you're not concise in that, if you're not clear in that, it's going to become it's going to be known in your applications as unambiguous. So you want to try to be as clear as you can in that and understanding who your organization is. Okay. Also, in being prepared and in understanding whether you're ready to do this, is you may have to seek approval, a signature on the federal grant application from other folks. So if you're a school, can the principal sign off on the federal grant application, or does it have to go to the superintendent, or do you need somehow approval from someone within the Department of Education? City Council, sometimes the mayor has to sign off on them, Board of Supervisors. If, you know, for us, we have to work within the Department of Economic Security organization, so sometimes our grants have to be reviewed, not necessarily signed off, but reviewed by the executive deputy director of the agency, and that all takes time when you are under a tight time frame to write your application. So if you have an authorization or approval process outside of a nonprofit who is just the CEO, you want to make sure that you build in that time and understand who needs to review this and sign off on it. I'll give you a perfect example. I worked at the Department of Juvenile Corrections for a number of years, and there were so many applications being written by the superintendent of the school or somebody else within another division department. It never went through any formal review. It never got even reviewed by the budget people. And it was like, what do you mean you're applying for a grant and the director of the agency hasn't seen this? That all came to a stop immediately. We revised the policy, and no grant was ever applied without the director signing off on it. And you have to build in time for that. And if he didn't want the grant application to be submitted, even though it had been in the past, that was what he wanted. So you have to make sure that you kind of work within your organization in the approval process. The other things that matter in this is, do you have a strategic plan in place that's updated on a regular basis? Do you have an evaluation process in place to capture data that the funder is going to ask you to put in place? Because you'll have to report on not only did you do the scope of work, but what are the numbers? What are the outputs and outcomes in sense? So you want to make sure you have an evaluation process in place. And then when you read the solicitation, do you think your organization matches what the scope of work is asking? So you want to make sure that you're a good fit, in other words. Another area, key area being prepared is, and this is normally a requirement now, is who are your community partners and to what extent are they going to offer any sort of support? Is it just, oh, we'll give you a little support and we'll support you on a weekend project, or are they going to provide some sort of financial match or in-kind match? So, and how do you need letters of support? Do you need memorandums of understanding, which is very different from a letter of support? So start thinking about those immediately if you're going to go after a grant. And then the other internal thing you really want to be very honest about is your capacity to do these things, because writing a grant is going to take a lot of hours, and it shouldn't be left to one person to do. So think about your capacity as an organization to research, to write, and collaborate with those partners, be able to comply with the terms and conditions, which should be or should always be included with the application, so that you know what your responsibility is in terms of complying with the funder's requirements. And there's a lot to them. Our terms and conditions, I think, are up to 23 or 24 different terms. And so not all of them are really difficult to understand, but you just want to make sure your organization is aware of that. And then the other two things is the overall performance of the contract. So again, making sure you're not a high-risk grantee, but your organization is in the perfect capacity and ability when you receive that award notice, you're able to hit the road running. You could hire someone if need be, or you got the key staff ready to go. You have your partners in place. You're able to hold meetings immediately and move forward. And then sometimes there are matching dollars required with contracts. Not all of them require a match, but if you do, those are things that you're going to have to work out before your application is submitted. And then, because notices of award go out sometimes 6 months later, you kind of want to check in with those folks and say, hey, are you still going to be able to provide the matching dollars? Or we just got awarded and you I'm like 30. Oh. I love computers. I love technology. Okay, next slide. So I'm having Sarah move me to the next slide. Solicitation. So this is where we get into like the square fitting into the circle peg. Again, these are the other things you wanted to keep in mind. Are you eligible to apply? Maybe you're not. You know, sometimes that changes depending on the scope of work, or sometimes there are funders who only award to local units of government, or it asks for a collaboration. So perhaps you're not the right fit for it. Maybe you're not an agency that's eligible to apply, but you can certainly collaborate and be a partner. Pass that solicitation on to that organization. The other thing is the due date far away. We try to keep ours at least a minimum of 6 weeks of when we release it to when it's due. That sounds like a lot of time, but it's crunch time because there's a lot to do in the beginning stages, as I've just covered. You want to assess your organization. You want to talk to partners. If there's matching dollars, you want to figure out how you're going to achieve 25% match, for example. Those are all things you want to consider. The other thing I would tell you that it's based single award versus multiple award, and depending on if the scope of work tells you how much is available to apply, it may not be worth your time. So those are also a consideration, things to consider. The other two things is just make sure that when you are kind of determining, can you do the next slide? Keep this picture in mind. There's no way for me to say don't go after an application. I always encourage applicants to go after an application if they're a right fit and they could submit a really good quality application for the funder to read. If you don't get it, it's okay. And if you decide to attend the pre-application conference, you hear what the funder wants to award, what the application is about, all the different requirements. You go back to your committee, your board, your partner, you say, you know what, I just can't do this at this time. That's okay. At least you've taken the time to read it. You've taken the time to understand what's required. And you certainly, there's certainly no harm in that. What you want to avoid is putting something together at the last minute and your partners don't know anything about it, but you're expecting them to do something for you and they don't have an idea, or you have the wrong signature on forms, or you're missing information. Your application is going to be viewed as very weak and possibly not even reviewed at all. So doing some of this pre-homework is my suggestion. One of the best things you could do is take the time to read it and thoroughly kind of assess your organization to see if it's something that should be taking your time to do, because it will take multiple people working on it and multiple hours. Again, if it's not a fit, it's okay. Prepare for the next round. And with that, I'm going to be quiet for a couple of minutes and pass on to George. He's going to talk a little bit about his experience with grants. Sometimes good, sometimes not, but I think it's important to hear all of the experience he has gone through. George, take it away.
Hi, my name is George Garcia, and I am Executive Director of Southwest Institute for Families and Children. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization here in Phoenix, Arizona. What we do is we work with people with disabilities through empowerment, advocacy, and providing knowledge on different services and how to advocate for themselves. Yeah, we've actually received a few grants from the ADDPC here. We've submitted and we've received, and sometimes we've been rejected for some of the grants that we have been applying, and it's been a learning process for us. But you know, we're really glad that we've been able to work with this organization to provide to work on some of the projects that they've submitted grants for. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that Marcella did share a lot of information as far as terminology, and it does seem a little daunting sometimes, but the request for proposals is pretty straightforward, I would say, and it just takes time to really read it and understand what is being required or requested. That can make it a whole lot easier to apply for a grant. The way it works in our organization is when a RFP does come out, we take the time, we'll download it, we'll read it, we'll see what the scope of work is requiring. Well, first of all, we see if we're even eligible for it. And then we'll read the scope of work. We'll see what does the grant actually want us to do. And we'll sit down in our organization and talk about it. Is this something that we can do? Is this something that's fits within our purpose as an organization? Is this within our mission? One of the things that you do not want to do is go after a grant that is not within your mission, not within your purpose. You're not going to have the expertise in doing it, and you're not going to be able to, serve well your organization or the DDPC for that matter. And it just makes you look bad. So just first of all, understand what a grant is and what is its purpose. That doesn't mean that you don't actually, you shouldn't go after a grant if it's not exactly fitting within your purpose. The case in point is right now we did get funded for the supported decision-making grant. Now that grant did ask for a lot of things that we are good at within SWI. We work with people with disabilities. We work with families who have, family members with disabilities. And, providing education and training and all that good stuff. One of the things that we are not actually that like legislation and stuff like that. But we do have partners, and we did, when the supported decision-making grant came out, we did talk with other organizations and say, can we work together? And it was finding those right partners. And in our case, we're working with the ARC of Arizona and Arizona Center for Disability Law to come together. And I think all three of us really complement each other and really help each other figure out, how to put together a grant that would meet the needs required by the DDPC and then ultimately do the work. That is not, that just took us time to really read the grant and understand what it was saying and then write the grant. The way it works with us in writing grants is we will read it, we'll discuss it, and then we kind of formulate an idea of what kind of project can we submit that will meet those needs. And this takes a lot of time to discuss it within our own organization and the partners that we're going to be working with. And once we have a cohesive vision of what a project will look like, we'll then talk about how it's going to be written. We will separate sections out to different people, especially if it's something that one organization is going to take the lead on. For instance, in our case, like doing legislation or working directly with the legal community, judges and lawyers and stuff like that. We'll ask those organizations to write their portion, but we tend to have only one lead grant writer that's going to bring everybody's information that they've written and bring it all together and make sure that it has one voice, sort of say. And that way it flows and it makes sense, and it ultimately sounds cohesive and is meeting all the requirements of the scope of work. Understanding the scope of work and understanding what is required is very important. You do not want to submit a proposal that is not actually doing what the proposal is asking. And I take that from experience. We at SWI learned the hard way. We had a great idea for a project. We loved the idea of what we wanted to do. And we wrote a really, really good grant. It was not what was required or asked by the DDPC. And rightfully, they denied it. It was because even though it might have been a good idea, that's not exactly what the DDPC needed to fund. Those ideas of what needs to be funded is determined by the goals and objectives of the council. And if that program is not within meeting those goals and objectives required by the RFP, then it's not going to get funded. And we took a lot of time and a lot of hours within our organization and our partners, and ultimately it was denied, and we missed out on that. But now we take the time to really understand it and go through the process of saying what is required, what can we do, what is realistic, what can we really do. You don't want to overpromise and ultimately disappoint your funders, because it reflects bad, and it could affect future funding for your organization. One of the big issues or one of the big concerns by people who are thinking about applying for grants is the matching funds. Now, they have this requirement where it's 25% or so, depending on where you're going to be doing your program, of matching funds for a grant. And that could be a little difficult depending on how much you're going to apply for. But there are ways to work and make sure that you're able to do it through different things, whether you are using some of your money or if you're doing in-kind services. So for instance, if you're having volunteers, well, volunteers can actually help you meet some of the matching funds requirements. Or if you're going to use some of the office space, or you're going to use, so you have to really look at how can you use some of your organization's volunteers or services or something like that that can really help you meet those requirements within the matching funds. What else should I say? I'm trying to think of what else can I say. So, but yeah, it can be a little scary sometimes to think, oh, I have to provide a huge, grant and writing and all that stuff. But once you take the time to sit down and really understand what's required, it's not that difficult. One of the most difficult things that I find when writing grants is making sure you stay within the time or the page limits of a grant. Sometimes they'll say you got 10 pages to write, to answer 5 or 6 different questions on how you're going to provide services or a project for this grant. And, it becomes difficult. So, you have to really think about how is it going to work? How can you explain it in a way that makes sense, that meets those requirements, but is said in a way that is concise and easy to read so that people that are going to read your grant understand it and go, yes, this makes sense. This looks like something that can be achievable, it's relevant, and it's measurable, and all that stuff. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say.
Okay, George, thank you so much. I have moved computers because I apologize with the buffering in another site that I was sitting at. So hopefully I won't have that issue anymore. So what we're going to do is click on to the next slide. And I want to follow up just with a comment George made in terms of budgeting and match, because I does sometimes think folks think it's going to be really difficult to find. And it can be because federal grants have a requirement that you could only use matching funds from a source that has not already been allocated as match with another grant you have. And also, you cannot use other federal funds to match a federal grant. So there should be some language in the solicitation that gives you some guidance in regards to matching funds. One of the things that I tell people is think of it as your costs. Think of it as you're requesting $50,000 and you're going to put some money into personnel, some money into supplies, some money into travel, and you need matching funds, and you could use those same categories or other categories that the funder lays out for you. But you're going to have to get it from another partner. It could be cash or it could be in kind. They do have to be documented the same way you would track your costs for the funder. So there's going to be some language in the solicitation that should guide you and give you some ideas of what to do. And if you're really stumped on it, call the lead contact person for the solicitation and say, I need some assistance on some ideas of how to capture in kind, how do I document it, and so forth. There should be always some assistance, some technical assistance provided to the applicant in that regard. Okay, so the next couple of slides, what I want to cover here for the folks here is the evaluation process. And this is really to give you an idea of what we do internally once the applications are all submitted in. What do we look at in terms of how do we view a good proposal, a bad proposal? Do we keep it in the yes pile, the maybe pile, the absolute no pile? So this is going to give you a behind the scenes as to what we do. So each proposal, when we are reviewing them, they are compared to the scope of work. It is horrible practice, and you should, your contractor, your federal person, your program person like myself, should never, ever, ever, ever allow any of the evaluators to compare an application from one to the other to the other. It's mixing oranges and apples and grapes and tomatoes in that pile, because everyone is writing differently and may miss something. So what you want your evaluation committee, when they come together, and this is something I stress with the evaluation committee because I provide training for them, is you're reviewing each one individually and against the scope of work and the requirements in the scope of work. That's it. And you're going to be scoring them based on some parameters. So it could be against answering all the questions, providing the attachments, having signed signatures on things, having a budget that is allowable and going to be effective and it matches the narrative. It could be evaluating the key staff that they have proposed. So that's what the evaluation is going to be based on, number one. Points are not necessarily something that's mandatory, but it's something that's encouraged. So I could do 100 points or 1,000 points, and I could be giving specific points for different components area, like budget may be 50 points and key staff could be 25 points. It all depends on the technicality of the scope of work. And I will at least give in this solicitation a layout of what we will be evaluating on the criteria. Remember to use the mouse here. The evaluation is facilitated, by the program manager, the procurement person, the contractor. And so, such as myself, what I do is before the solicitation is due, I make sure I find an odd number of evaluators, provide training for them on the scope of work. I give them some documents to read ahead of time. I give them an evaluation form, and I work out all of those dates and times that I may need for them to block their calendar off. So they will usually have anywhere from 10 to maybe 14 days to read the applications by themselves before they come and meet together as a group for discussion and whether we're going to move applications for clarification or negotiation or what. So we set the parameters around at that time. The other big requirement is two things, is that at least in our process and what I have developed for the council is it is my responsibility to type up a consensus report describing the entire solicitation process from beginning to end, so that it lays out for the public that these are the awards that were made based on whatever recommendations, and these are the reasons why. The reasons why solicitations were not selected is also provided a narrative in there. It becomes a public document open for review once the solicitation closes and awards are made. But that usually is what we do, is a consensus report, because the evaluation committee has to come to a consensus on how they move forward with each of the applications. So if you didn't get a grant, you'll be notified by me or by the funder, and it should be in writing. Obviously, you would want to contact that contract manager back and find out why, and they should be willing to meet with you and discuss with you some of the technical reasons why from the evaluation committee. So they could share with you some of the comments that may have been made through the consensus report, or they could be sharing with you those applications that were awarded. So you can ask and find out what you are able to review. And it's worth your while to do that if you didn't get an award, so that you know what sort of mistakes you made. Maybe there were some common ones, maybe there were some other ones that were a little bit more specific, but at least we'll give you an idea. I believe I met with George 1 or 2 times on a grant. I know I've met with other folks. I highly encourage it, because we want to see winning proposals, and we want to see your organization succeed. And you only learn if you learn what you didn't do right, so that you don't repeat the same mistake over and over again. Okay, should we take a risk on you? I think that kind of went back to the 2 slides that I mentioned about high risk. The funder, such as us, these are some of the things that we could toss your application once you apply. So I do an initial review, and some of the things that kind of come across my desk are many of these things that I've seen over the years is failure to meet and provide sufficient information on the scope of work, simply stating that you're going to comply or do the work, and you provide very vague sentences, but not anything specific about how you plan to do it, when you plan to do it, how you plan to monitor yourself completing the work. If you miss certain questions you don't answer, that is all insufficient information for an evaluation committee to read. I could certainly pull your application out based on that and just toss it in the no pile. If there's no signatures or to bind you into a contract, an offer and acceptance form, that's one of my big key ones. I'll toss your application out for that reason. So you want to make sure you don't miss signatures because that means you didn't take the care and the time enough to review everything and to make sure everything was in place. Dot your I's, cross your T's. And so really these are things that shouldn't be issues anymore for applicants, but just these are things I've seen over the years that will get your application tossed out. You don't follow instructions on how to submit an application. There's going to be very clear instructions on what is required, even to the point of font, the type of font to use, the size, margins. Those are some things that we've had to put in over the years, because honestly, we've seen applications come in with like a very unusual font that becomes difficult to read. If the evaluation committee is reviewing 20 applications and you have a very unusual font, or it's handwritten, or you didn't follow instructions, I can guarantee you that evaluator is going to have a difficult time getting through your application at midnight, and they're on number 10 and they've got 10 more to go. So, and everything's going to be sounding the same and fuzzy. So you want to make sure you understand what the instructions are on how to submit and in what format. So make sure you follow that. If your organization is disbarred or suspended, don't even apply if you're high risk. So make sure you just get your organization out of that criteria. Previous poor performance and or misuse of funds. A lot of folks are going to know about your organization if they worked with you in the past. Some evaluators sometimes are very familiar with the realm of the applicants that come in and can give some information in regards to that to the funder, such as myself, or I may have a lot of information on the previous performance of an applicant. So we want to make sure it's objective and not subjective, and we're going to want to just keep that in mind. But those are some things that can also be that we want to use as a criteria. And then we never, ever, ever accept, it doesn't matter who it is, we don't accept late faxed or applications that are received at another agency. If you don't send it to who and how and by the due date and time, you're going to be out of luck on that end. So watch out for those deadlines. So you got an award. Now what do? I tell you, first thing, celebrate with your team and your staff that helped you get to that point, because it's a big process. It's a lot of work. And once you've got that out of the way, on the weekend to celebrate, review, the program manager is going to be working to send out the award letter, offer acceptance form, any additional terms and conditions, letters to you in regards to when your contract begins and when it ends. So sometimes it may be another month before you can begin your project. Maybe it's going to be 2 months. It all depends on the solicitation and the timeline. So don't begin if you happen to find out that you've been awarded. You want to wait for those official letters of notification to your office, because they're going to have specific deadline time dates for your contract period. So if you're going to hire someone, maybe you want to start the hiring right now, but you certainly don't want to start kicking off your program and start billing us if their contract period hasn't begun yet. You won't be paid for that. So just watch out for some of those things. The other thing is, I strongly recommend for the key applicant to build a really good relationship with your program staff, your fiscal staff, the program person who may be doing some monitoring, some site visits, or the contract person like myself who oversees the whole process. And the reason being is because we're going to have to review your program, your reports. We have to review your fiscal invoices. We may going back and asking for clarification on anything. And you just want to have a good report overall. It's not to ding anybody, but you just want to have
that good relationship, because throughout the grant process, if it's a 1 year or 3 year, it doesn't matter, you're going to run into some barriers. You want to keep them abreast of it as much as possible. You may be asking for future amendments. You may want to know if there's going to be renewal applications available. So it's always in the best interest for both parties to be on the good and up in front for everything. The other couple things too with staff that will be working with the lead applicant is we'll provide ongoing technical assistance for the applicant throughout that entire grant period. We may offer, we haven't done this in a while, but I know a lot of federal agencies do. They require their applicants who are awarded to attend trainings, so post-grant trainings. And sometimes you have to budget in for that, especially if you have to go back to Washington, D.C. For trainings or meetings a couple times a year. Again, that will be in the scope of work, so watch out for that. But if there's any trainings on offered, make sure you get the right people to attend, or at least communicate that you're attending and ask if you could bring somebody else. We want to make sure that you guys start off on the right footing on that. And then just be aware of some due dates. Put those in your calendars when narrative reports are due. If you're going to be invoicing on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, let us know so that we can make sure that we're on the lookout for those things. If you're going to be late, notify the staff that you're going to be late and ask for an extension period. Don't go more than 30 days without reporting your narrative report when it was due. You're going to get a call from the program manager about you being late on reports. And if you're submitting invoices, but we haven't received your narrative reports, we're going to hold off on paying those until we get everything submitted before then, and we can review it and make sure you're in compliance. So again, just keep your program management staff abreast of those situations. Be prepared for any site visits you're going to have, and work with staff on any program and fiscal issues. Amendments, keep staff, your program manager, in communication with changes to your contract. And what I mean by amendments is you have to make a change with a key staff person, or you're going to have to make a change in your budget to support maybe another contractor or something, or less hours for a contractor, or you're going to add in an additional community that you want to work in because another community wasn't as receptive for you guys to work in. Anything that changes what you were originally awarded should be communicated a minimum of 30 days in advance so that we could work out those technicalities and make sure it doesn't change, it doesn't veer off from what you were originally awarded and what the scope of work was about. So if you just want to do A, B, and you have to throw in A1, A2, B3, B4, B5, and not jump to X, Y, and Z, don't do X, Y, and Z, because then you're not within your scope of work and what you're awarded. You want to notify staff, make sure you get something in writing to approve your amendment, because if you don't have anything in writing, it's void and we will not pay for any changes that take place because you don't have your amendment approved and in writing. So be aware of that. So file all amendments, follow instructions. I did that. Additional information. You want to keep everything that is related to this contract in separate fiscal invoices and filings for auditing purpose, for backup documentation that we may require. You have to keep that for a minimum of 5 years for when the contract period ends. So at any point, we can ask for backup information for all your invoices. Your CPA for auditing purposes is going to want all your backup for fiscal stuff. So make sure you have the ability to store that. And that's a requirement under the OMB circular. Final checklist of do's and don'ts. So here are some key things to just keep in mind. Read it, the solicitation multiple times, give it to multiple staff to read. It's always good to have different eyes on the document. If there's a pre-application conference, you may want to attend that so that you hear what's being spoken and what's being allowed. And then you're always allowed to submit questions even after the pre-application conference. to the contractor. So make sure you send them in writing so that they have a chance to respond back to you, because sometimes there may be something that's not caught by the contractor, such as myself, and I may have to amend the whole solicitation. Sometimes it's just a technicality thing. So you could always submit something in writing. Again, this goes back to your organization, the last bullet point. Just know the strength of your capacity to do the research, the writing, and the administration of the contract if you're funded. Follow all directions. Don't leave anything blank. Don't deviate from the submission and how the applicant, the funder wants the application submitted. It will get your application tossed out. So make sure you follow directions exactly. The instructions will lay out exactly what should be submitted in with your application. As George stated, you want to watch out for page numbers, signatures, font size, typos. Please, typos, and your budget, make sure they add up. Those are some of the most common things we see. And then the big thing is your due date and time and who you submit, or whether it's just electronically. So those should all be front and center as you're preparing to submit your application in. You want to try to speak the same language as a solicitation. And one of my things is that these take up a lot of room in applications in the narrative that you don't really need to do. So take out anything that's unclear or emotional statements. We know that we're working with a population that could be high risk or high need, and you're speaking to a group of folks sometimes that understand that, and you don't need to restate it because it's very factual based. When you're writing applications, it's very data-driven, factual based. What's the problem? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to implement it? And as much as you can limit that, that's helpful for the reader. Quantify as much as possible if asked. So what you're targeting, maybe 30% of self-advocates that reside in the rural county of Gila, for example. That gives a really good idea of who your target audience is and how you're going to match and how you're going to track that or outreach to that. Again, this last one is I get guilty of this, is I want to spell acronyms out, and you want to be able to don't spell them out in the application because you don't want to assume that everyone knows your acronyms. You want to partner as much as you can, as quickly get those folks on board with you if you can. You could provide templates for letters of support or memorandums of understanding ahead of time so that they can fill in the blanks. But make sure that you get those. Let them know when you need them. Don't wait till the last minute to get those letters of support within your application. So make sure you have a couple of days that they can get those to you, especially if they're going to be part of your budget and provide matching dollars or in kind. That should be stated in there so that the funder has the ability to see that they're going to be serious about committing and partnering with you. The big thing with budget, you want to treat it as your own personal budget. Understand the circular you're working under so that you know what the costs are that are allowable and not. Has to be relatable to your narrative. Don't put something in there that has nothing to do with your narrative. It will be picked out and it will be, and then we'll take it out. We'll ask you to take it out if your project goes for a clarification. So make sure that your costs are really tight and only related to the project. Have a final draft ready for edit and review at least 2 weeks prior to the due date. So that gives you 4 weeks to write if it's 6 weeks out. You want to be able to have a couple of people to review it to make sure it flows, that it matches the requirements, and that you can make sure it's consistent with the scope of work. I have time. So please look at some of these things. And then the last thing is your checklist for, put together a checklist to make sure that you're all together for signatures, supports, that you know who you're dropping it off, and how it needs to be in. I'm going to be able to just finish up a couple of things here on the checklist for don'ts. Take a look at these things, and if you have questions, please let me know, because I guess we have to go to Q&A because I'm already at 2:06 and I thought I had to 2:15. So please look at these slides. I would tell you on this one, don't restructure, don't leave anything blank. Those are big things that I see. Don't ramble, and don't say, one of the things I've seen before is refer to page so-and-so because you didn't want to type it out. That will annoy the evaluator and get your application tossed out. So some things on the don'ts, again, I went over the do's. Just be careful on these applications that you have people reading it at the final point where you know you're ready to submit. And you can always ask your program contractor to say, I have this application ready to go. I'm waiting on some information. Do you allow information to come in at a later time or something? They'll let you know right off the bat. Usually the answer is no. So you don't want to wait to get these delays, and make sure you have them ready to go when you need them. So set up an internal timeline is what I'm saying on these. And then again, it's not a problem if you don't know where the parking is at, if there's traffic, weather, especially if there's hard copies that need to be dropped off. Make a hint of that. I've had to turn people away because they got stuck in traffic and I couldn't accept their application. Okay, so we're gonna now get back to questions and answers, and I think I probably have to ask John to kind of intercede in this part here.
No problem, Marcy. If you want to ask a question of the presenters, please use either the chat area or the Q&A pod, and we'll move it forward to them.
Okay, hi Marty. We have one solicitation being released out probably in the next 48 hours that has to do with community inclusion and an index to be created. We do have other solicitations around self-advocacy and employment and recreation, which is going to be under an inclusion goal to be released out later on this spring. So we're going to have several. Our staff, our media person is updating our grants page. We have been updating our grant solicitation application process. And so we hope to have all of that pretty much posted here within the next 30 days. So please make sure you're on our e-list to receive the notification when solicitations come out.
Thank you, Marcy. We have a question from Marilyn.
Okay, tell me, I'm trying to find the question. Where am I finding this question? Because I had a hard time understanding it. I see it. Do we ever fund projects that are not part of an RFP?
And it's Marilyn Guard 2.
We do not. So the only way that we are able to fund a project is through a competitive solicitation. Let me caution and say this. If we have folks on the phone that are part of universities or other state agencies, there may be times when we would ask, we may ask those entities only to submit in an idea about funding a particular project idea, but we have to follow our own internal policies and guidelines around that. But the normal process of how we fund is through a competitive grant application. But usually state agencies and some universities we can partner with on one-on-one basis, but they still go through a review process and council approval. Okay, so the Community Inclusion Index is a very specific one to help our office create an index on community indicators. It's going to be kind of specific for those groups or agencies that know how to create a web template around that. So it may not fit for everybody, but we hope to have that released in the next, like I said, next day or two, and it will be 6 weeks out before it's due. Any of the other ones, I don't have any specific timelines of when we're going to release them. So I would just encourage you to check back on our website. You can always contact me or send me an email too, because I'm going to start developing those schedules as we move forward in the springtime.
Thank you. And Monica addressed this for a question from Carol saying, will this PowerPoint be available or emailed to those attending this webinar? If you look to the Files pod in the lower left-hand corner, you can click on the title, How to Apply for ADDPC Grants, and you'll be able to download this file, and that is a PDF of all the slides that were presented today. If there are any other questions, we have a couple more minutes, and we'll go from there.
I see Daniel's typing. What is the ADDPC policy for overhead? So we have to pass through, Daniel, a minimum of 75% of our funds as pass-through dollars. So we do keep a percentage of that grant aside for administration costs, for staffing, and for oversight. Yeah.
Let me just chime in to say that we have the federal, our federal authorities, our federal government says that we can only allocate 10% of funding to indirect costs. So when it comes to overhead, that would be considered an indirect cost. So we have a letter. So if your grant department needs to see that, we can surely share it with them.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Any other questions from our audience?
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for being on the phone and for being on this webinar. Erica and I really appreciate it. George, thank you so much. And we look forward to working with you. So please keep us posted on any questions you may have and apply for our grants.
And remember to fill out the evaluation that you're going to be getting, and that'll let us know what we need to fix in the future. And just remember that any project that you do should be targeting our people with developmental disabilities to some extent, okay? And if you need to know what that definition means, it's under the federal definition of developmental disabilities, okay? Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you again, Marcy and George, for your participation, and thank you all for applying. It's because of partners like you that we're be able to be successful.
Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, John. That ain't you.
Thank you.